In this video, we're going to discuss techniques for breaking a mobile application into smaller subcomponents. So rather than creating a very large UX component that has all of your panels and your panel cards and panel navigators, etc., in a single component, we're going to discuss how you might break that large component up into smaller subcomponents. So let's start out here with a UX component, the simple mobile application that has been written as a single UX component, and let's just briefly take a look at the functionality of this demonstration component. So you can see that this component has two panel cards. There's panel card number 1 and panel card number 2. The two panel cards are wrapped in a panel navigator. Panel card number 1 has a list control, a label, and then a button, and then panel card number 2 has another list control and then a header with a button. So the idea behind this little simple application is that the user will select an item in the first list, click a button that will bring the second panel card into focus, showing the records in this second list that match the first list. So let's go ahead and actually run this. So you can see here's our first list control over here showing all of the customer IDs for customers in the customer table, and then when I click on a row here and then click the show orders button, that's going to give focus to the second panel card showing me all of the records, all of the orders for that particular customer, and then I can either cancel, which goes back to the first panel card, or if I go here and tap on a row, it tells me that I selected order number, say 10634. If I go back there, for example, and click on another row, that's 10560. There I go back to 10650. So this is obviously a very simple mobile app, but it's been designed as a single component, and in this particular case the component is not very large, but you can easily see how by putting all of the controls into a single component you could end up with a very large UX component if your application was complex. So what we're going to do now is show different ways in which this component could be divided up into separate components. So in this particular case we'll discuss how it can be divided up into two components. So now let's go to this next component over here, and you can see that what we've done in this component is we've basically gotten rid of the panel navigator completely. We just have the panel card that has the list control in it, and then we have a button that's going to open up a child component. And let's go ahead and run this now, and we'll see that the behavior of this application looks very similar to the application that we've just looked at. So I go here and I click on a row, and then I click Open Child Component, and a panel navigates into view. If I hit cancel, I go back. If I go there now and say Open Child Component again, you can see we get the child component showing all the data for the selected customer. If I make a selection over here, we show the record that was still selected. So what we've seen over here is that the behavior of this component is identical to the previous component. However, the architecture of this is very different because the child list is not actually in this component, it's a child component. So if we go here and we look at the JavaScript behind this button, we can see here in our action JavaScript that we've just got a standard action JavaScript called Open UX Component. So let's pause now and then pick it up in the next video. So we're continuing our discussion of how you can break a UX component into multiple subcomponents to keep the size of the parent component from getting too large. And we're looking now at the button here that opens up the child component. So let's go back now to the builder here, and we can look at the child component. We can see that it's a standard Open UX Component action, and we're opening up the component called UX_child mobile. This particular component happens to have an argument called what customer ID, and we're going to bind that argument to the customer ID column in the list control. So that's the argument binding over there, And then basically, in order to configure this pop-up window so that it looks like a panel, we chose the predefined window styles option over here. We chose panel, and then we turned off has header. And the reason that we turned off has header is because the child component that we're going to be opening up has its own header and footer, or actually its own header, and we don't want to display two headers and in that window. So let's go ahead now, click the OK button, and then save this, go ahead and run it. And now you can see when we basically click the button, the child component opens up in a window, and the window of course was styled to look like a standard panel card. But other things I'd like to point out here is inside this action here, we've also specified that we want to use a cached version of the component, and what that means is that the first time we click the button to open up the child component, it's going to render the component. But then when we close the window down and then open it up a second time, we're not going to have to re-render the component. We're going to be using the cached version, which means that it's going to display very quickly, but we are going to need to synchronize it, which means we're going to need to basically reset the argument binding to the current value of whatever is selected in the list, and then refresh the list control inside the child component. But the refreshing of the list control in the child component is handled for us automatically, because we've just checked this box here that says refresh the UX when it is opened. So what's going to happen now is when we reopen that child UX component for a second time, the refresh methods of that child component are going to be called. So let's go ahead now and take a look at that child component. So we'll go over here and we'll choose mobile child, and you can see here is the child component. It's just got the list control, and then it has a header which has got the cancel button. And if we go now to our client-side events, we can see that when the child component is opened a second time, the synchronize event takes place. And what we want to do is we always want to make sure that the list control is scrolled to the top of the list. So here we're going to get a pointer to the list control. So the list control is called orders. You can see there the list control is called orders. And when we go back to our client-side event, we're going to get a pointer to the list control and then scroll the list control to row number 0. So that's going to ensure that when we display this child component, we're automatically scrolled to the top of the list. But now let's go back to controls here and take a look at this button called cancel. So this cancel button is designed to close this panel down when the user has completed, when the user wants to cancel and return back to the parent component. So let's pause now and pick it up in the next video, where we'll discuss the JavaScript that's behind this cancel button. So if we bring up the builder here for that button, we can see that it's executing some JavaScript here called close container window, and then we've passed in this, which is a pointer to the button itself. So close container window is one of the methods in the UX component objects library. So we can just see here we can actually get it directly from the autocomplete over here. And basically this tells us is that when a component is opened in a pop-up window, this is going to close the window that it was popped up in. So this code here is going to close the pop-up window that contains this component. So that's how we got our cancel button here to work. But notice that we've also given this button an explicit ID called close window button. We could have given it any particular name, but this is a meaningful name that will be helpful. And now what we'd like to do is also write the code so that when the user clicks on a row in the orders item, we automatically set the value of the label in the parent component saying which record was selected, and we close the window down. So let's go back now to list properties and go over now to the OnClick Event, and you can see here in the OnClick Event what we're doing is we're getting a JavaScript variable that's giving us the value of the order ID that was selected in the list component. Then we're getting a pointer to the parent component, so the component that opened up this window. We're getting a pointer to that component by using the object's getParentObject method. So now we have a pointer to the parent method, and then we're saying that if that pointer is valid, and the reason that we're doing this test is when we run this component standalone, in other words when we run this child component by itself, when it's not a child of the parent component, then this is going to return false, and we don't want to execute this code. So here you can see that what we're going to do is, once we've got a pointer to the parent, we're going to set the value of that label control to order selected, which is the row in the which is the order ID from the row that we clicked on, and we're going to close the containing window of the element p button. So p button is just a pointer to the particular button called close button window, and the reason that we do that is we can't pass in this over here because that would be meaningless. We need to pass in the pointer to some element that is in that window, and so that button that we specifically named close button window is clearly an object that is inside that window. So here we go ahead and we get a pointer to that button, and then we pass that pointer into the close container window function. So this is going to basically set the label in the parent component and then close the window down. So let's go ahead now and then save this and then go back to the parent component and run it. So you can see now when we click on, say, Anton, well, let's actually go here and click on, say, Bonap, which happens to have a large number of child records. So we click here. This opens up the child component, and now if we scroll this list down here and then we click on a row which is 11076, we can see that the pop-up window is closed. We set the value of this label control over here, but now if we scroll to, say, another entry, say this one over here, which happens to have very few child records, you can see that we can see the item in the list because we've scrolled the list back to the first row in the list in the onSynchronize dialog client-side event. So what we've done in this video is shown you here how the single component was broken down into two components, but the behavior of the application wasn't really changed. So in the next video we're going to discuss yet another technique for breaking a component into multiple subcomponents. So we're continuing our discussion of how a UX component can be broken down into subcomponents, and what we've discussed so far is how a single component which contains two panel cards here inside a panel navigator could be broken down into two components, and we've discussed how this component here was broken down into a much smaller component that had a button that opened up another component in a panel window. But another technique would be to take this component over here, and then instead of displaying all of these controls on this panel card here, we could instead display an embedded component on the second panel card. So let's go and take a look at this now. So here you can see here's this next component here where we still have the same overall structure. We have our panel navigator, we have the first panel card which looks identical to this panel card over here. We've got the list and the button, but then the second panel card over here, which used to contain the header and also the orders, was broken down into just a panel card that contains an embedded UX component. Now obviously the component here that we started with wasn't particularly complex, but this could have been a much more complex component, and with many controls. where the advantage of replacing a whole bunch of controls on a panel card with a single embedded UX component would be much greater. But so again here you can see that we've done that. We've broken this component up now into two components, and then when we run it again we see the exact same behavior. So we click on the row Anton, then click this button. That's going to bring the child component into view, but it's actually going to bring the panel into view in a standard way, and that panel contains the embedded component. Then when we make a selection there, you can see we've said you selected, and we've got the order number of the record that was selected. So again, the behavior of this application hasn't changed at all. However, the architecture has changed. So let's go back now and look at how this was done. So you can see that this second panel card here contains this embedded object. The embedded object was placed on the component by choosing this embedded object control. And then when we go back to this embedded object here, we can see here that we've specified the name of the component, which is UX child mobile embedded. We've given the embedded component an explicit alias, UX child. We've bound the argument what customer ID to the list control. So the list control itself was configured. If we go back to the list control, we can see that the list control was configured to return the value of the customer ID field. So that means that when we open up this the component, this embedded component is going to have this argument what customer ID set to the value of the list control, and the list control itself is going to be set to the value of the customer ID field. So you can see furthermore that we've specified that this embedded component should not be rendered until it becomes visible. So that means that when we initially render this component, the panel number 2 is not visible, and therefore the component that has been embedded on panel number 2 has not been rendered. So we haven't actually incurred the cost at this point of rendering that child component on panel 2. So now when we go and we look at the button over here on show orders, we can see that this button is gonna, first of all, it's gonna go ahead now and synchronize that component. So we'll go there, and if we go and look at the edit action here, we can see that the button is going to synchronize the embedded component called UX child, and then we're going to go and give focus to panel card number 2. So every time we click on this button now, we're going to synchronize that child component. So we're continuing our discussion of how you can embed a child component into a panel, and what we're discussing is the action on this this button over here. So let's go back into the builder. So we can see that not only, so that the two actions that are being done is, first we're going to synchronize the embedded component so that it basically it's updated to reflect the list, the items in the list for the selected row in the list control list customer, and we're also going to bring that panel into focus. So here we go. When we run this, we can see here that we bring the second panel into focus, and this panel, this component here that is displayed on this panel happens to have a header. So this is why this header is showing up over here. And when I click this button cancel, we're going to go back to panel card number 1. But the button that is taking us back to panel card number 1 is inside the child component. So let's go take a look at how that button was configured. So the child component here is called UX Mobile Embedded. So we'll go back here and find UX Mobile Embedded. And we can see here that here's the button that goes back to panel number 1 in the parent panel. And if we go look at the button, we can see that the code here is actually quite simple. First thing that we need to do is go and get a pointer to the parent object, and then we call the parent object's panel set active method to go back to panel card number 1. So we can't just simply call dialog.object.panelSetActive because the dialog.object is a pointer to the child component, and the child component does not have panel card number 1. Panel card number 1 is inside the parent component, and the similar technique is used in the list itself. So if we go to the list, when the user selects an item in the list, the code that's being executed on the OnClick event is, you can see here, we're getting basically the value of the order ID that the user clicked on. We're getting a pointer to the parent object, and then we're setting the label control to the order that was selected, and then we're setting focus back to the parent panel. Actually, this line of code here is not necessary, so we can just go ahead and delete that. So this is setting focus back to panel card number 1 in the parent component. So what we've shown over here is another technique of using embedded components on a panel to break a large component up into smaller subcomponents. Thanks very much for watching.